Negotiating conflicts within ourselves are often the most difficult negotiations of all. All of us must negotiate between different needs which may not be compatible. We may feel deeply about providing our families with a high standard of living and spend a great deal of time at work to earn a high salary, but that can conflict with the need to spend time with our families. These types of conflicts can result in stress, which has to be resolved if we are to be fully functioning human beings. Dr. Ed Krauser is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Pasadena, California. He has had over 20 years of experience as a therapist counseling men and women who have sought help to deal with stress more effectively. In our conversation, Ed shares his experience with us on how we can manage stress, which we experience at home and at work.
In your work as a practicing therapist, then, people come to you usually under a great deal of stress.
Yes.
Is the person's self-esteem or self-concept a critical factor in their ability to deal with stress?
I think it is. I think one of the things that brings people to a psychotherapist is not so much the conflict that they're in, but when that conflict does some damage to their feelings about themselves. It's a blow to their idea of who they are. And, for example, if a man has a severe business reverse, his whole feeling about himself as a competent, as a potent person undergo a severe blow. And as a result of that, he can react very strongly and begins to question his judgment, begins to question his value and his worth, and it seems as if he has a distorted picture of himself as a result of this reverse. Now sometimes it's a factor of a man who seems to have the idea that he should have been able to anticipate anything, and when he hasn't, and there is a reverse, he really takes it very, very personally. And in a case like that, yes, his self-esteem is deeply affected. There's a similar situation, for example, when a wife finds out her husband has been having an affair. Her self-esteem is deeply damaged. She's often angry, but mostly hurt. And it's at times like this that the job of the therapist is often to help the person to assess what effect this has had on their self-esteem, and when the person has been overreacting to the situation. Yes, you want to help them to see in a realistic way, what their own contribution has been here, but I emphasize in a realistic way. And once the person does that, I think their self-esteem will increase.
If we had to define or characterize what a good self-concept is, what would be some of those characteristics?
Generally, I would say a good self-concept is one in which a person feels that weighed on their own scale of values, if they were to weigh themselves as a person, generally they come up with a favorable evaluation. Good self-concept does not include the idea that one has to be a saint, doesn't include the idea that one is infallible, just that one has more successes than failures, more good judgments than bad judgments. I'll give you an example. Talking with a business executive at one point who was a personal friend, and I had made a serious mistake in something, and I shared it with him. And he said to me, "You know, Ed, I am president of a firm that employs a few hundred people, and I make more mistakes than anybody else in that firm. And that's as it has to be, because I make more decisions." Mm-hmm. Now, that was helpful to me. And to me, it's an example of his own good self-concept, in that he didn't hassle himself when he made a mistake. He was able to pick himself up from there and go on.
Negotiators often face that kind of a situation. Mm-hmm. They're under a high degree of pressure, and quite often they do make mistakes in that process. So what you're saying is that a person with a good self-concept, under those conditions, can accept those mistakes and go on from there.
Yes. I think the difficulty with self-concept is often what we expect of ourselves. It's after we make a mistake, that part of ourselves that comes in and starts pounding on us. That part that expects or demands perfection, or that part that, you can call it the bully, within us, that starts to bully us when we've made a mistake. We make a mistake in negotiations, for example. That part can beat us down and can frequently stop us from being effective from then on. A lot of the work of the therapist is to call attention to the operation of that bully. Not that we don't need, something within us to help us to evaluate when we have made a mistake. We need that. But on the other hand, we don't have to be hit over the head with it. Called to our attention, yes, but not beaten down to the point we can't be effective after that.
As part of a person's self-concept, does that include a person's values, attitudes, beliefs about his or her perceptions to life and conflict, the different types of conflict that people experience?
Well, I think a person's self-concept deals mostly with how they feel about themselves. I think coming from that, we're going to have either a more or a less realistic ability to evaluate the people around them, their attitudes towards those people, and their perceptions of those people. Put it this way. If a person has a good self-concept, one aspect of that is they're not easily threatened. And not being easily threatened, they're open to a pretty accurate perception of what's going on around them and what's being said to them and how people are acting in reference to them. On the other hand, if a person's self-concept is spotty, if it has many areas where the person feels particularly vulnerable, he'll try to defend against any perception which is going to impinge on that and hurt and block those things out. One of my teachers, Fritz Perls, said, I think very accurately, that his job as a psychotherapist was to help the patient to see him, Fritz, as he really is, meaning without distortions. The idea being here, if I as a therapist can really help you, you won't have to color your perceptions. You won't have to distort. You won't have to be blind to what I really am. You won't have to idealize me. Neither will you have to make me into some kind of an ogre. You can clearly see my strengths, my weaknesses. You can see me as I am. And I think that's one aspect of a person with a good, strong self-concept. They can see those around them as they are. That, is in the area of the perceptual aspect of a good self-concept.
Can you give us some examples, Ed, of people that you've worked with who have a negative self-concept and how that's affected their ability to listen and communicate effectively with others?
Yeah. Take, for example, an executive with whom I've worked. This man, as a child, was in a situation in his own family where nothing he did was ever good enough. His picture of himself suffered, and as a result, as he grew up, he decided he's really going to get to the top, and he's going to prove himself. Well, he had all these messages from childhood that he wasn't really any good. And in his attempts to overcompensate for that, he could never quite still that voice. So that when he actually got himself into the position of being president of a firm, he always had strong doubts about himself. Therefore, whatever his employees did was very easily taken as a threat by this man. If they made a natural mistake, it threatened him because it would hurt the company and therefore his own image, and he overreacted. He was hypercritical in very much the same way that his parents were. His employees did not feel cared about, they did not feel understood, they didn't even feel they were getting an honest evaluation or a decent break from this man. Consequently, his firm had a high turnover. And business did suffer, and he brought about the very thing he was afraid of. Now, I would relate this to his self-concept. It really blocked him from being effective and supportive with his people.
Well, let's go into a negotiating situation. And what you've said, it's important for individuals to acquire a greater awareness of their behavior in situations, negotiating situations where there is an element of conflict, to find out how they are dealing with conflict and whether or not they're dealing with it defensively or constructively. How can we acquire a greater awareness of our behavior, an understanding of ourselves and our self-concept?
Well, that's not an easy thing to do. And of course, it depends on the negotiations in which you're involved. I would say there are basically two ways that I'd recommend where we get some awareness of our behavior under stress. One is by listening to ourselves, beginning to pay attention, if we don't already, to the cues that we have within our own bodies. If, for example, in a negotiating situation, we find we're short of breath, if we find our stomach hurts, if we find we're beginning to tense up, that's a clue that we may be under so much stress at this point that our judgment can get impaired. That's one way, is to pay attention to yourself. You can hear your own voice, for example. Don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes when I'm under stress, I hear myself talking, and there's a little voice in the back of my head that says, "Hey, what are you saying? That's not what you really feel." We're not ringing true to ourselves, and sometimes under stress, though, we feel ourselves called upon to get into some kind of a role, some kind of a part that really doesn't fit. And we start pontificating, or we start lecturing, and we're not really saying what we believe at that point. We can catch ourselves doing that, and we can back up.
Also, the tone of the voice, Ed, is that part of it too?
If you can learn to listen to the tone of your voice, it's not easy. That brings on the second thing I was going to say. If we're open to listening to what other people are telling us, we can help, use them to help us cue into ourselves. For example, I recall a couple of psychotherapists in Atlanta who always worked as a team. And they explained why they worked as a team. One worked as a therapist, and the other one worked to keep an eye on the therapist.
To give the other person, the other therapist, feedback?
Feedback as to what he was doing, as to when he was on, as to when he was off, as to when his own feelings were entering into the therapy in a non-constructive way, when the therapist's own problems were getting tangled up with a particularly difficult patient. So the second therapist then was there to provide feedback to the first one and to take over when necessary. In negotiating, you can do the same thing.
Day-to-day situations, right?
Day-to-day situations, in negotiating situations, especially if there are a team of negotiators and the team members trust each other. When one watches the second and sees that the second is getting overextended, that's a good time for the first one to step in or to signal the first to relax a little. Wives are often very accurate in seeing when we're under too much stress, and if we'll listen, children the same way. Children can let us know. They watch us very carefully.
How do your children indicate to you that something is up, that there's some stress involved?
With me, they'll do things like, "Daddy, you're not really spending any time with us lately." It's a good clue to me that I'm working too hard. Or, "Gee, Daddy, you're grouchy." "You smoking another cigarette, Daddy?" All these clues, they have a deep stake in, you know, seeing to it that the parent doesn't
How about their body language?
overextend themselves.
How about their body language?
Well, I think they pay more attention to my body language, you know, than I pay to theirs, actually. But I know I've been uptight with my son, for example. If I walk in and put my arm around him to hug him and he stiffens, then I know it's been too long. You know? But they're very good at reading my body language. They know when to come over and when not to. But my family will help with that. You know, they say, my wife especially, gee, you're tense today. And I may not be aware of it. And despite what I said before, it's not always easy to become aware of when you're tense. But at a time like that, I'll stop and she'll be right.
What aspects of situations involving conflict hinder or obstruct an individual from using their capabilities to their fullest?
I think mostly those of the situations, those aspects of the conflict situations that frighten us. I think when we become frightened, that's when we tend to constrict. Now there's a funny relationship here. A certain amount of stress puts us at our most effective level of behavior. If there's not much stress, we relax and we coast and we don't use what we have. When we begin to get some pressure or some conflict or some stress or some threat, then we mobilize and generally use what we have to its maximum point to cope with this. However, if that stress continues or grows greater than this optimal point, we begin to tighten up, and then we don't function effectively. You could say we become paralyzed with fear, not simply in our bodies, but in our emotions, in our minds, and then we make mistakes, or then we pull back, or then we become rigid.
What is stress, Ed?
I think stress is anything which calls for our bodies to increase their metabolic output. We often think of stress as something negative, but Hans Selye in his recent book pointed out that joy is a stress also. Intense joy puts the body under a great deal of stress. Maximizing bodily output, joy can be exhausting. So I would say that stress is anything which calls for us to burn more fuel, if you will, metabolically. We most often think of stress in terms of a challenge or a threat that we have to meet.
So can its impact be both negative and positive?
Yes, I think it depends on the level of stress. Stress can be very positive, and then it calls for us to put out our best. It can be negative if we're addicted to it. For example, there are people who continually set up high levels of stress as a way of keeping busy and as a way of avoiding being able to sit back and relax and take stock of themselves.
What are some of the types of stress that you deal with when patients come to see you?
One of the chief types of stress that bring people in to see me is the stress that comes from a difficulty in a marriage, for example. I see a lot of people who come in when a marriage is breaking up, or at least it looks as if it's breaking up. One of the partners has left or is about to leave, and the other one is feeling deserted or frightened. Their feelings about themselves are really thrown down because literally somebody else is telling them, I don't want you. You're
worthless.
You're worthless to me. Yeah. Or I like you, but I can't live with you anymore.
It sounds like
You're too angry, you're too depressed, you're too much of a failure, you're too frigid, call it what you will. But I see people under that kind of stress. I see people under stress of, turning 30 or turning 40 or turning 50, and they do an evaluation of themselves at that point, and the contrast between how they see themselves and what their expectations for themselves were pretty great. And they feel some depression as a failure in terms of their own expectations. I see a good number of people with that kind of stress. People come in with the stress of not being able to sustain a relationship or be close to anybody. A person who, for example, goes through affair after affair after affair, but can't really feel any kind of a close attachment to either the man or the woman they happen to be with. They say, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I get close? Why can't I stay close?"
What are the sources of the anxiety in those situations?
I think one of the chief sources of anxiety in all of those situations is, am I a worthwhile person? Oversimplified, yeah, but basically it comes down to, do I have a right to be the way that I am? Do I have some right to exist on this earth if I'm not pleasing to someone else, if I don't seem to be able to be a financial success? It's as if their expectations are so heavy that when they don't meet them, they really question their fundamental worth as a person. This is a great stress. The classical stress with people who are depressed is when something goes wrong, a tremendous amount of guilt. For example, a woman I've seen who found out that her husband had been having an affair for 3 years. Couldn't feel angry at the husband, nor could she feel angry at the woman who she knew quite well and who was a guest in her home on several occasions. Instead, she said, it's my failure. It's my fault. I'm sure she made contributions, but was completely unable at that point to do an evaluation of her husband, who, instead of talking with her directly about his complaints with her, took an easy way out and found a quote, more understanding, more sympathetic, end quote, person on the outside, and surreptitiously, met his needs elsewhere without having the strength to come to her directly. And she couldn't get angry at this. Her capacity to defend herself went down in the face of this stress, or her self-esteem collapsed. Part of the work with her was a realistic assessment. What are her strengths as a person? What are her assets? What are her values? And where she has some legitimate gripes in this situation, to the point where she could begin fighting for herself.
How did you help the woman assess her strengths and her capabilities?
Well, one way was to point out that as she described herself in such negative terms, I would simply say, now stop a minute. Now that you've said those things, would you stand back from yourself and take a look and see just how realistic you are? Is this in fact true of you, and to what degree? And when she was able to do that, she was able to say, no, it really isn't. My husband told me that he went to this other woman because he could never talk with me. It's true. I'm not an easy woman to criticize. I don't take criticism well. But on the other hand, on those occasions in our marriage when he let me know very strongly that he was unhappy with me, damn it, I sat back, I took stock, and I changed those things that he was unhappy about, but he so seldom told me. And at that point, she was able to switch from this picture of herself as someone who was just closed, to criticism by her husband. So therefore, she basically was accepting his premise that he had to go elsewhere. And now she was more able to stand by her own side and say, no, he's got some responsibility for playing this martyred role and keeping his mouth closed, being a long-suffering husband, you know, and then going out the back door to find his satisfactions. That's one way her self-esteem came up. To point out her creativity, her energy, what she contributed to the marriage, help her do a realistic assessment. These are important things at a time like that. I think one of the most important things that you can do by way of helping a person with their self-esteem, and maybe this sounds funny, but you can listen and you can give attention. Simply giving someone your full attention is enhancing to their self-esteem, because it's the clearest indication that you consider them worthwhile, and what they have to say is worthwhile. I don't want to give the impression that the role of the therapist is to, you know, keep patting people on the back. There's nothing more transparent than cheap reassurance or flattery. That's not what it's about. But when you see somebody who's being unfair to themselves, you can call them on that.
How can a person counsel themselves when they're dealing in stress, in a stressful situation? They know that they're under stress, they're starting to feel it. How can they take care of themselves under those types of situations to prevent that stress from really becoming dysfunctional?
I think the first thing, of course, is to know that you're under stress and to feel it. You know, the ways I mentioned before, if you hear your voice and your voice is tight, if there's a knot in your stomach, if your breathing is not coming easily, first of all, know it. I think the second thing you can do in a situation like that, if at all possible, is detach yourself for a moment. Step back. Take a deep breath, first of all, and let it out slowly. An awful lot of stress comes when we constrict our breathing, for example. It's a physiological thing. There's a chemical imbalance in our bodies. We restrict our breathing and we feel anxiety, and that leads us to restrict our breathing more, and then we feel more anxiety, and the doggone thing builds. So if you can step back for a moment and take a deep breath and let it out slowly and completely a couple of times, you'll feel yourself calming down. Another way is to stop and to say, what in this situation, you know, is really frightening me this much? What's really going to happen here? Try to get unhooked from old terrors which may no longer be appropriate. The boss who's criticizing you may not in actuality, you know, be the daddy who came down on you so punitively. This may just be a boss who's saying, look, I need something from you. I didn't get it. I'd like you to apply yourself better. He's not saying you're a lousy kid. He's not saying I'm going to beat you or I'm going to punish you. He's just saying, hey, I need a little more attention in this area. So if you can stop, if you can pull back, if you can, first of all, take care of yourself physically with your breathing, let yourself calm down, and then if you can try to unhook all those old tapes that come from childhood and try to take a more realistic picture of where you are right now.
So it sounds like you're saying using both your head and your feelings.
Using both your head and your feelings. You've got to have both going together. Sometimes in the stress of an argument with your spouse, for example, you feel yourself getting excited out of all proportion. Stop. Damn it, just stop. Stop and shut up and cool down for a minute.
What types of defensive behavior occur that prevent people from stopping? Why do people become defensive?
People become defensive when they're very frightened. I think that's typically what happens in arguments between spouses. This woman I'm married to is saying something about me which is so patently unfair. How can she believe this of me? And, rage sets in, but underneath the rage is fright. This means that the person I'm living with really doesn't know me, doesn't understand me, would believe such a thing of me. So alien to my own concept of myself, and that's frightening. That's where the rage comes, and it's almost I will pound out this idea that you have of me. I will yell you down. There's another aspect to this too. Sometimes we become the most defensive and the most frightened when we feel the most helpless. And that's one of the things you have to watch out for.
Helpless.
Helpless. When you want to get something across to the person with whom you're negotiating, or the person with whom you're arguing, and there's no way to get it across, you can feel helpless. If they have an idea about you in which they see you as malevolent in some way, and it doesn't seem to fit, but there's no way to get that across, their mind seems to be made up, you can feel very helpless at that point. It's like, I want you to know me, I want you to understand me, I want you to see me more as I see myself, or at least hear how I see myself. And if the other person feels closed to that, or appears to be closed to that, a helpless feeling sets in. And at that point you can begin to get very defensive.
Defensive or angry? Or
angry, because angry feels better than helpless.
Mm-hmm.
It feels lousy to be helpless, to feel impotent. And so you get angry instead, and instead of feeling weak, you feel strong. You may not be right. You may be talking a bunch of nonsense. You may be attacking in some way that you'll regret later on. But in the meantime, you're covering up your feeling of helplessness.
How do you deal with anger effectively, both within yourself and also the anger that's being directed to you by another person?
Well, let me take the latter part of that first, because it's easier. One of the things that I find I can do when someone else is angry at me is to listen. I can just let them express it. One of the things that I've learned is that what this person says about me is, that doesn't make it so. They can be expressing their own pain, their own hurt, or their own confusion. They can be expressing an anger which is completely justified, in terms of something I've done. But I don't have to defend against their anger immediately. I can hear it. First of all, giving them a chance to express it helps. Their level of excitement goes down. And secondly, if I can hear what they've said, I'm in a better position to evaluate where they're coming from. When I feel they're right, I can acknowledge it. That's information that I'm getting. Mm-hmm. So their anger can't be helpful to me. Where I feel they're not seeing me, I'm in a hell of a lot better position to bring that out to them after I've let them express it. One of the difficulties in arguments is that while the other person is talking, you're never really listening. You're just standing there waiting for them to shut up so you can, throw a few bricks of your own. Or you're so busy batting away what they're saying that you never really let it come in. I think self-concept comes in there. If you're scared of what they're saying, you're going to bat it all away. And I think one of the things that's been very helpful to me is to gradually become less scared of what other people are going to say to me or about me. And I think when I listen, I help to diffuse their anger a good deal. Now, with my own anger, I attempt, first of all, before I get angry, to really evaluate what's going on here. What am I so upset about? That's not always possible. Sometimes I'm so uptight that I just blow. And I can blow in some ways that are not helpful to anybody, and least of all me. After that, there's not a hell of a lot I can do except apologize. Just take the responsibility for having blown. Hopefully not throw myself in the garbage can because I've made a mistake. I'm human, and I've blown, and I was wrong. Okay, I can acknowledge it without crucifying myself over it. At other times, I can be more reasoned in my anger, and I consider that more of a confrontation than an explosion, and I think that can be very helpful. That comes down, of the nature of, hey, look, and I'm fed up. I don't like this. I've said it X number of times, and now I'm really ticked off here. And I'm letting you know. I don't like this, I want that. That doesn't mean I'm going to get it. At least the person to whom I'm talking knows where I stand.
Are there ways to frame that communication so that it does not create defensiveness in the other person?
Yeah. I think one way is that in what I say, I attempt to let the other person know that I'm not, making an attack on them as a human being. I'm not calling them, worthless, and I'm not attacking their self-esteem. Mm-hmm. It's just that, hey, there's something going on here I don't like. There's something you're doing that really ticks me off. It's not that I'm against you or don't like you or down on you, but this thing just happens to frost me. I want something else. Occasionally it's a person I really don't like. And in that case, fine, I'll let them know. But I think one of the things you can do which help to avoid getting a lot of defensiveness up is to try to be as clear-cut as you can, and as focused as you can on what bothers you and what doesn't. And you can also be diplomatic. There's such a thing as a diplomatic confrontation as well.
What do you mean by diplomatic?
Diplomatic confrontation? Well, first of all, if you've got the basis of a good relationship between you, you don't have to do a lot of preambles to your confrontation. Mm-hmm. But by preamble, I mean, and sometimes when there's some impaired relationship here, you do have to do a preamble, like saying, look, I'm not attacking you as a person. There's one thing that's happening though that I'm angry about. And sometimes it's important, I think, if you're not that angry, that you can control yourself and acknowledge this, is when you're expressing your point of view directly in a confrontation, to also take into account where the other person is, so that you might say something like, look, I know you're trying. I can see the examples of you trying, but this still, this still appears to me less than I need. For example, if I'm in an executive position, working with a secretary, and there are still too many mistakes on the page. I know you're trying hard. I can see it. You get here on time. I know you stay over sometimes, but there are still too many mistakes on this page. We have to do something about that.
Ed, let me put the big question to you. Mm-hmm. What do you do when stress signs are telling you that you're killing yourself? How can you better deal with stress in your life?
Well, to the big question, I have to come up with an answer which seems so simple that I'm afraid I'll come across it, as a jackass. But when stress signs tell you that you're killing yourself, damn it, you have to stop. That's not easy to stop. But I think the biggest thing in stopping, when you find out that stress signs are killing you, when your physician tells you, when your wife tells you, when your mirror tells you that you're killing yourself, is I think then you have to pay attention to what is stopping me from stopping. What the hell is keeping me on this merry-go-round? And all the quick rationalizations, come in. I've got to put through this deal, otherwise the company will collapse. I've got to work this hard because we need the money. I've got to keep myself running because I'm caught here and there's no way out. Well, that's baloney. Basically, I think that's baloney. When I say stop, I mean you have to pay attention to what in you has been forcing you on this suicidal course. put it another way. What's been keeping you your own enemy? When you think of someone who is being worked to death, think of slave labor, for example, where you take a man who's a slave and you just keep driving him, underfeeding him, the kind of things that were done to POWs during the war when they were underfed and overworked. But any kind of slave labor, and you think of the brutality of that, well, you get incensed. Well, think of yourself in that category. Here you are, working yourself to death. Now, what's working you like that? In reality, is it Uncle Sam, who demands taxes from you? I doubt it. Is it really the family that has to have this and has to have that and has to have the other things, so you have to kill yourself working to make these things? Not likely. Chances are when the family is coming over to you, with their hand out for everything that money can buy, they're really saying to you, look, Charlie, we haven't got anything of you. So at least, give us something of your pocketbook. And so when the family comes to you like that, and they're saying, we're really not having anything of you, maybe that'll give you a clue that all of the driving and all of the killing yourself that you've been doing has been a kind of a flight away from feeling, a flight away from really focusing on what you need by working too hard. If you keep working, you keep too busy to think about what's really important to you. Sometimes we substitute status or money or power, any of these things, for the things that we really need. We think of these as the things we really need, and we drive ourselves to get them. But in the way we drive ourselves, there's self-hate in that, because we're really being brutal to ourselves. We've lost that friend inside of ourselves, which helps us to take care of ourselves. And so when we catch on that we're driving ourselves to death, it's important to stop and say, hey, do I really dislike myself this much? And if I earn X amount this year, am I using that as a standard? That's what makes me worthwhile? Well, if we are, then we're really selling ourselves short, because that economic goal that looks so important to us is really just a symbol, to prove our worth. But it's, on the other hand, a flight away from something inside of ourselves that's been telling us, hey, you're not even worth enough to be good to yourself. You're not even worth a vacation. You're not even worth a day off. You're not worth really being taken care of. You're not worth slowing down enough so that somebody can come up and touch you. That's what I mean when I say stop. It's stop and focus on what in the devil is really of ultimate concern in our lives. And I think when you stop and you take a look at what's of ultimate concern in our lives, it very seldom comes out to be power, or money, or prestige. But if you can really stop and take a look at these things, you see that they're really only substitutes for something else. They may cover our loneliness, they may cover our emptiness, they may cover our despair, they may cover our helplessness. And sometimes if you stop, you take a moment to feel these things, they don't kill you. You may cry, you may feel sad, and if you're lucky, you may have a wife or a friend with whom you can share these things. And then you can maybe begin to develop the friend in yourself.